the kitchen is a woman's place, isn't it? Yeah, and I think she should stay at home, caring for her husband. But if she works, her income should never be higher than his. Of course, and a man isn't a true man when he cries, right? Wait, have you ever heard of stereotypical roles related to genders? Probably. Today's video deals with the topic of gender roles, but especially we will be taking a closer look at different gender perspectives in the short story The Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri. If you haven't already watched this channel's video about the summary and structure of the story, feel free to do it in advance and come back to this video afterwards. But without further ado, let's start.
Now we come to the character Mala. She incorporates the gender perspective of a traditional Hindu Indian woman. But how did we come to this decision? So, first of all, Mala is influenced by social standards. Even though her father is a teacher and her skills include cooking, knitting, or sketching landscapes, they are classified as inferior. The reason why she does not find a potential husband is because of her skin color. In India, there's a special ideal of beauty. People with brighter skin are preferred because it stands for success, prosperity, and beauty. Dark-skinned Indians have much more difficult to find jobs or to be recognized in higher social classes. Another important influence is the caste system. Although it was abolished several decades ago, this system still shapes society. Due to her appearance, she belongs to the lower caste and faces significant disadvantages. For example, a string of men have rejected her to her face because of her darker complexion. Furthermore, she does not make the sole decision about her life. This proves the role of her parents, because they took over the fate of her life. In India are arranged marriages very common. Many parents had the responsibility to find their daughters a husband. Mala is almost 30 years old. For this reason, her parents are afraid of that she would never marry. After the marriage with the narrator, she has a new position as a traditional housewife. She always cooks and cleans and takes care of her husband by getting up earlier to prepare him food. Mala does not live according to her own interests and preferences. Her highest priority is now to be a good wife and mother after the birth of their son. In addition, she moved all the way to America for her marriage. Nevertheless, she keeps her traditional identity. She wears a sari, gold bracelets, a small red sickle on her forehead, and the edges of her feet are tinted with a decorative red dye. All in all, she is also still dependent after her marriage, because her husband ensures their prosperity. She does not work, so she has to ask him for money. Finally, these aspects support our assumption about her character, which is why we see Mala as a representation of a traditional Hindu Indian woman.
Another interesting fact is that there are two widows in the story, portraying different gender perspectives. Let's start with the narrator's mother. When her husband died of encephalitis, the widowhood had influenced her life immensely. After her husband's death, she had lived for another 14 years, but still refused to adjust to life without him, and the increasing depression had driven her insane. In the end, the loss of the narrator's father resulted in her death in 1958. This aspect implies that she was and felt extremely dependent on her husband. She probably based and concentrated her life all around him and the family, just as society expects from a typical housewife. Do you see some similarities to Mala here? What do you think? Is Mala just as dependent on the narrator as the narrator's mother was on her husband? If you want to, you can write your opinion down below in the comments. But now let's move on. In this case, the loss of the father means the loss of the head of the family, whose income had provided for their lives. Active feminists would probably argue that the woman should fight for her independence, and the narrator's mother should have dared to take this role, to find a job, and to care for her family on her own. Instead, the narrator's brother abandoned his schooling and began to work, as the role of man, especially in India society, determines. The man has to be the hard-working and strong head of the family, and if the father dies, the son has to take his role and his duties in terms of securing the family's well-being. The narrator declares what pained him most was to see her so unguarded, to hear her burp after meals or expel gas in front of company without the slightest embarrassment. This behavior can be seen as diametrical to what society expects from women. The stereotypical female behavior that is dominant in India demands a quiet and modest appearance, a nurse in character, and, of course, an appropriate outward appearance. But now, let's move on to Mrs. Croft. When the narrator gets to know that she's a widow too, he starts to worry. That's understandable, right? Mrs. Croft is in the same situation as the narrator's mother had been. Or are they actually in a quite different situation? At least, they cope with the widowhood in an almost antagonistic way. Mrs. Croft lives alone, at least without any member of her family, since the narrator actually moves in with her in the narrative. This implies how independent she is, since the narrator's mother did not live alone the 14 years after her husband's death, and still sadly could not cope with the loss of the narrator's father. She's depicted as a very strong and also fierce-looking woman. Helen, her daughter, visits her once a week to help her with the household, but it is declared that she doesn't really like accepting any kind of help. Another aspect that strongly reveals her desire for independence. The narrator also wants to offer his help by warming her soup, but Helen warns him that this would actually be the sort of thing that would kill her altogether. The recipient gradually understands that independence is what keeps Mrs. Croft alive. Maybe this is also the reason why she dies a short time after she breaks her hip and cannot be left alone for even a minute, as Helen declares. Nevertheless, Mrs. Croft's independence does not allow the recipient to experience her portraying the feminist perspective in the short story. If you want to learn more about feminism, feel free to take a screenshot of this page, but we are not going to go into too much detail and focus on the story. The main reason why Mrs. Croft cannot be seen as a feminist character in the story is that she has a clear image of a so-called perfect lady. It can be seen that she sticks to certain gender roles and roles that show the stereotypical standards and values of society back in time. To define it more precisely, back in the time when she was born and raised. Mrs. Croft is 103 years old. That means she was born in 1866. Although it's understandable that she attaches to these standards, since she was raised in this society with the typical demands on women, it may be assumed that she's also not at all open for new ways of thinking and modern gender perspectives. She even mentions that she would arrest any woman who wears a miniskirt. Well, that's actually a very extreme gender perspective, right?
The narrator of the short story The Third and Final Continent is a 36-year-old unmarried man. He moves from India to the UK and then to America because of his work life. While being unmarried at this age is not typical for Indian standards and shows his independence from family and home, his life orientations like education and money show his goal of building up his life, which in contrast is typical Indian. Furthermore, he steps into a marriage which was arranged by his older brother and his wife. This step shows his respectfulness and acceptance towards authorities in every area of his life. In the following, he accepts his Indian role of a man in a family, but still shows problems to get used to it and feels a bit weird. An evidence can be seen in the quote, "I parted with them reluctantly, but I knew that this, too, was normal." In this situation, Mala, his wife, asked him for a few dollars, whereupon his thoughts are described. Overall, it is difficult for him to get used to familyhood, which is shown in another quote, very detailed. "I waited to get used to her presence, at my side, at my table, and in my bed, but a week later we were still strangers."
Now that the video is almost over, let's check if we remember the most important aspects about gender perspectives in The Third and Final Continent. Do you succeed in our quiz? Question 1. What are the 3 most important aspects that influence Mala's life? A. Arranged marriage. B. Career. C. Caste system. Or D. Ideal of beauty. Multiple answers are correct. Feel free to pause the video, think about it, and then come back. The correct answers are A, C, and D. Question number 2. Why can't Mrs. Croft be seen as a character with a feminist gendered perspective? A. She doesn't accept homosexuality. B. She has a clear image of a perfect lady. Or C. To her, a man who cries is not a true man. What do you think? Only one answer is correct. So the correct answer is B. She has a clear image of a perfect lady. That brings us to the last question. At what age did the narrator marry Marla? Again, only one answer is correct. A. 16. B. 34, or is it C. 36? The correct answer is C. 36. Did you succeed? If you liked this video, you can give us a thumbs up. You could also subscribe to our channel if you're interested in more exciting videos about short stories or relevant topics for the Abitur in general. Thank you for your attention and see you soon!